Every profession or hobby has a confusing thing. Pokemon breeding has IVs and EVs, medicine has IVs and EVs, Pokemon VGC has IVs and EVs, the ancient Romans have IVs and E pluribus unum, and Pokemon speedrunning has IVs and EVs. Okay, I guess it's all actually the same thing. Now, there have been many YouTube videos over the years that have attempted to demystify the shockingly counterintuitive and yet super important hidden mechanics in Pokemon games that are IVs and EVs. But none of those videos had white boys standing in front of green screen with microphone, something I invented that only I am doing. What can I say? I'm pretty original. In this video, I'm not just going to explain IVs and EVs, but I'm also going to show you how to derive the algorithm that applies those stats to your Pokemon's base stats in this, the year of our Lord MMXXIV. You can see how the civilization fell. The system gets like really unwieldy after like 10. Alright, let's start with IVs, which is short for individual values. Starting in Generation 1 and 2, there was a system called DVs, which is short for determinant values. This system works slightly different than IVs, so I'm going to start with IVs, which began in Generation 3, because that's the system that Pokemon still uses today. Each Pokemon has 6 stats: HP, attack, defense, special attack, special defense, and speed. These stats dictate how Pokemon interact with other Pokemon in battle, as well as a few other in-game mechanics. Every Pokemon has a set number for what this stat is, and that's the same for every member of that species. Those are your base stats. Game Freak chose these numbers based on what the Pokemon is and what their type is, like Steel types usually have high defense stats, same with Rock types, whereas Electric types usually have higher speed stats. Again, Game Freak has chosen these base stats and you can't change those. The base stats represent what a given stat will be at level 50 given no other modifiers. To make a given Pokemon more viable, you might want to change those stats. That might mean you want to increase an already high base attack stat, or ensure that an already low speed stat stays low, thus ensuring that you move after your opponent does. There are really only 3 ways of doing this. The first is to keep catching or breeding your Pokemon to get an advantageous nature. The various natures raise one stat and lower another by a set modifier. Beyond that, you'll need to use IVs or EVs. Let's start with IVs. The reason we're going to start with IVs, or individual values, is that they are more fundamental to the Pokemon. Each of the 6 stats has an IV. An IV is a value that ranges from 0 to 31 inclusively. That means that there are 32 possible values in this range for any given IV. The way IVs directly influence stats is easy. At level 100, one IV is 1 stat point. So if you have a level 130 speed IV Zapdos and a level 131 speed IV Zapdos, the one with the 31 speed IVs will have a speed stat 1 point higher and will move first. The problem? Your Pokemon's IVs are generated when the Pokemon is generated. When you encounter a Pokemon in the wild, its IVs are determined the moment the encounter is set, just like how shininess works. This is the same for breeding too. Once that egg hatches, those IVs are set. This is an issue for speedrunners and VGC players. In speedrunning, for example, if you're speedrunning Pokemon Emerald, a Mudkip with 0 attack IVs is going to be massively worse than a 31 attack IV Mudkip. In VGC, maybe you want your Porygon 2 to have a 0 speed IV so that it's guaranteed to be slower than your opponent's Pokemon, and once you set up Trick Room, it will always move first. For all intents and purposes, when a Pokemon is generated, each IV is rolled as a random number from 0 to 31. That means in Emerald, if you want the tankiest, strongest, fastest possible Mudkip with 31s across the board, that's odds of 1 in 32 to the 6th power. You just multiply the odds together 6 times. That comes out to 9.3 times 10 to the negative 10th, which is roughly 1 in a billion odds. The good news is that you rarely need every single IV to be perfect. In a speedrun, you might not care what the special defense or defense IVs are if you don't plan on getting hit much. Maybe you won't be using any special attacks. Well, then that IV doesn't matter either. More likely is that there's a range of acceptable IVs, with some runs just getting luckier than others with a higher attack IV by a slight margin or something like that, but some IVs so low that you have to immediately reset. That begs the question though. IVs are a hidden stat. How do you know what your Pokemon's IVs are? Well, in recent generations, the game at least gives you a range of how good or bad the IVs are, but back in the day, you'd have to use a third-party calculator to figure out what your Pokemon's IVs were via some calculations upon level up. The good news is that for a lot of the older games these days, in speedruns, speedrunners can use RNG manipulation to get a better chance, or a 100% chance, at getting a specific starter they want with a specific IV spread. And the even better news for VGC competitors is that recent generations of Pokemon have finally added a way to change your Pokemon's IVs after they're generated. Hyper training via the bottle cap item allows you to maximize a Pokemon's IVs for a given stat. This is awesome. This makes training a Pokemon's IVs up to 31 super easy. But what about if you want an IV of 0 in speed, for example, like with the Porygon 2 Trick Room Setter example from earlier? Unfortunately, Game Freak doesn't have a way to use hyper training for that. For a 0 IV in a stat, or anything other than 31 for that matter, you have to still get lucky and just catch or breed one by chance, or you can make your odds better with an item like the Destiny Knot. Our next comic is a YouTuber who I guess makes silly little videos. Please welcome Adef. That's probably right. Please welcome Adef.
Hey, what's up, guys? How's everybody feeling tonight? Pretty good? All right. Anyone else here that they're going to start using surge pricing on groceries? Pretty crazy, right? I mean, what's next? Am I going to have to rate my eggs out of 5 stars, or maybe even leave a tip for the chicken that laid them? I mean, I'm going to...
Talk about your ring. Where'd you get that watch?
Look, buddy, I know that everything you see on YouTube Shorts is just like crowd work, but I'm actually trying to do I'm trying out some like actual written material tonight. So if we could just, maybe stop. Okay. Anyway, anyone else feel like...
What ring is that?
It's from Holzkern. Okay. So's the watch. All right.
Do you like it?
What? Yeah, they're great. Anyway.
Talk more about Holzkern.
Seriously, man?
Yeah, that's what I want. I want that. That's my thing.
Okay. The video that this fictitious stand-up segment is a part of is sponsored by Holzkern. And they're actually a really phenomenal watch and jewelry brand that's great for really anybody. All their stuff is made from natural materials and is held to a really high quality standard, which is great. I have the marble and silver melodical watch, which I really like. It's definitely the nicest watch I've ever owned and completes like really any ensemble. I also have the marble and gold supremum ring, which I've honestly been wearing like every day since they sent it to me. I didn't think that these materials would work well with almost any outfit, but they kind of do. And they also help me feel really confident, which is nice, and also not how I'm feeling right now.
Is it a good Christmas gift?
Yeah, I mean, okay. Go to holzkern.com/ADEF and use code ADEF for 15% off site-wide, and also Holzkern guarantees that any orders placed by December 19th will be delivered by Christmas, so that's pretty good.
Wait, was this whole thing a sponsored segment?
Yeah, it was, yeah. Anyway, do you want to hear my political material?
No.
Yeah, I didn't think so.
The Destiny Knot is a really interesting item. If you breed a Pokemon and one of the parents was holding a Destiny Knot, your Pokemon that you bred will share 5 of the 6 IV spreads with the parent that was holding it. This means that if you have a Pokemon that has 0 speed IV already, you can breed your new Pokemon with that, and there's a 5 in 6 chance that they will have that 0 speed IV, which is really nice. Then you can just hyper train the rest of the stats with bottle caps, and you can use mints even nowadays to change the nature, and bada bing bada boom, baby, you've got a competitively viable Pokemon that's ready to battle. Right? No, there's actually one really tedious step left. EVs, or effort values, are another hidden mechanic that influences your Pokemon stats. Just like with IVs, each individual stat on every single Pokemon has a spread of EVs. The good news is that this is way more controllable than IVs are. The reason for this is that every single Pokemon starts with 0 EVs in every stat when you catch them. Whenever you defeat a Pokemon in battle, you gain EVs. Which EVs you gain and of what type is based on the Pokemon you KO'd. Did you beat a Magikarp? Well, that's 1 speed EV. Gyarados? That's 2 attack EVs. Omastar? That's 2 defense EVs. Good news is that some other nerds already got all the data together, so you don't have to know which Pokemon give what, you can just look it up. Okay, so we know how to get EVs, but how do they affect our stats? Why are they important? Every 4 EVs a Pokemon gains in a certain stat equates to 1 actual point in that stat once your Pokemon is at level 100. Essentially, if I KO 8 Magikarps and get 8 speed EVs, once I'm at level 100, my Pokemon will have a speed stat that is 2 points higher than if I didn't get any speed EVs. The catch here is that you can't pump infinite EVs into a stat. Every stat is capped at 255 EVs, and a Pokemon can only have 510 total. Now, since 255 isn't divisible by 4, you actually only need to get 252 EVs into a stat to max out the potential EV training in any one stat. This is where I want to introduce a mathematical function you may not have seen before, called the floor function. The floor function is represented by 2 brackets with the top cut off. The floor function tells you that whatever is included within them should be rounded down to the nearest whole number after the calculation is carried out. Similarly, there's also a ceiling function, which is the floor function flipped upside down, and that always rounds up. When calculating how many stat points you're actually going to get from the EVs you have in a stat, you do the number of EVs divided by 4, and then you take the floor function. So if I max out the EVs at 255, 255 divided by 4 is 63.75, which from the floor function rounds down to 63. That means that for 252, 253, 254, and 255 EVs, the stat is identical. You're not going to get any benefit from going above 252. Additionally, the fact that you can only have 510 EVs total is actually super cool in my opinion, because it means you have to be creative with how you spend these stat points. A common way to do this spread is to put 252 EVs into the 2 most important stats on your Pokemon, and then you have a lingering 4 that you can place into a third stat. You do have 2 EVs left over, but that's smaller than 4, so it doesn't matter. Spend them in defense if you want, I don't care, it literally doesn't matter. But you can get way more creative than this with your EV spreads. Watch any VGC team breakdown video, and you can see that there are really creative solutions to very specific problems in the meta at any given time. You can create a Pokemon that is a specific answer to a weird other specific EV spread somebody else is making that's cooking up in the meta right now. Okay, so EV training seems like it might be kind of arduous, right? You could go through the task of KOing hundreds and hundreds of Magikarp to get the speed EVs you need, but there are ways to actually accelerate this process. The first and easiest way is via using the vitamin items. You know, the items you always sold as a kid because you didn't know how they worked, but they sold for a ton of money? No? Just me? Okay, well, if you feed a vitamin to your Pokemon, they gain 10 EVs in the relevant stat instantly. Protein, for instance, raises a Pokemon's attack EVs by 10. Pretty convenient, right? Feathers, introduced in Generation 5, increase a stat by 1 EV each. There are items you can hold that double the amount of EVs you yield for a certain stat, and of course there's the very rare Pokerus, which allows infected Pokemon to gain double the EV yield across the board on every stat, as long as they're infected. Okay, now we know how EVs and IVs are generated and how they work. But what if we're the programmers that have to apply this to a Pokemon's base stats in the code? How do we do it efficiently? Well, we could write 3 lines of code, 1 line of code that accounts for a Pokemon's nature and applies that modifier, 1 for applying the IVs, and 1 for applying the EVs. This certainly seems like the easiest way, but it's kind of clunky and quite slow. But what if I told you we could write this function in 1 line? We can do all of this in just 1 mathematical sentence, and I'm going to show you how that works right now. To calculate a Pokemon's value of any specific stat at any level, the big brain bad boys over at the Pokemon Company came up with this beautiful little guy. This equation is really amazing because it's actually pretty simple. It's all just simple algebra based on the things we already know from this video. But let's start from the outside and work inwards. Okay, so to start, I want to specify that the way this equation works is different for your HP stat than the other ones. So we're going to cover how it works for the 5 other main stats, and then we'll do HP afterwards. First of all, we've got a floor function on the outside, so we know we're going to be rounding down at the end. Now, if we move 1 term in, we can see that the nature modifier is applied almost at the end of the equation, and it applies to all of the changes from IVs and EVs. This means that nature is really important, as it further multiplies the changes you make from IVs and EVs. Moving further in, we've got another floor function. Now, this floor function contains everything from the IVs and the EVs. First, we have 2 times the base stat. Then we add our IVs, because remember, at level 100, you just add the IVs. Then we add the floor function of our effort values divided by 4. This is the same thing we did earlier to determine, how 252 mattered. That gives you 63 EVs, but 255 is the same. That's this floor function. Then you multiply by the level and divide by 100. You can think of the level over 100 as a fraction that's being applied at the end of this calculation. They have 100 in the denominator by itself to make it look clean, but level over 100 is just to do a proportion. If I'm level 50, that means all of this is going to be halved, right? 50 over 100 gives 1/2, so the modifier makes sure that all these stats are half as powerful as they would be at level 100. Now, as for the 2 times the base stats, I think this is because base stats are for when the Pokemon is at level 50, and since we're comparing to when the Pokemon is level 100, they want them to be at the level 100 version first, before we apply IVs and EVs. As for what the Lingering 5 is for that gets added on the end, I'm not exactly sure. I think it's just a tuning and balancing thing, but please let me know in the comments if you know. Now we can move on to our HP stat. This one is very slightly simpler, as there is no nature that can modify the HP stat, so we don't have to worry about that. There's also a little bit of modification at the end, because the floor function at the beginning is exactly the same. The IVs and EVs and the base stat work the same to modify the HP stat. But they add on a little extra modifier of plus level plus 10. And again, I think this is just a tuning and balancing thing, because the HP stat just needs to be larger for Pokemon not to get KO'd literally all the time. And now you know, and hopefully if anybody ever has any questions from here until the end of time about IVs or EVs, they can just come watch this video, because I obviously answered every possible question any possible person could ever possibly have, and I answered it to the absolute best caliber, and it was perfect, and nothing was wrong.